Nobody was supposed to see it. No cameras were set up. No press credentials were issued. No announcements were made the night before. It was just another quiet morning inside the Indiana Fever practice facility. The kind of morning that usually disappears without a trace. Empty bleachers, dim overhead lights, the faint echo of sneakers against hardwood. And then something happened that nobody in the basketball world was prepared for. A ball left a shooter's hand. It climbed through the air in a perfect arc. And then came the sound. Swish, then again, swish. Then again, and again, and again, until the people inside that gym stopped what they were doing and simply stared because what they were witnessing didn't look like practice. It looked like something else entirely, something that doesn't have a clean word in the English language, something that sits right on the border between talent and supernatural. And the moment that short clip hit social media, the entire basketball world froze in place. 22 made three-pointers out of 25 attempts. Read that sentence one more time. Not in a game. Not with a crowd screaming. Not with defenders closing out at full speed in an empty gym. During a routine workout with no spotlight, no scoreboard, and no reason to perform for anyone. Just Caitlin Clark, a basketball, and a rim that barely knew what mist felt like that morning. 88% shooting from three-point range sounds like a number someone invented to win an argument online. But it wasn't invented. It was witnessed. It was recorded. And the moment coaches around the league saw that footage, something shifted in the air. Because this wasn't a highlight reel trick, this was a warning. And the question that nobody could stop asking was terrifyingly simple. If this is what she looks like in practice, what on earth is she about to do when the real games begin? Here is the thing about Caitlin Clark that casual fans still underestimate. She doesn't just play basketball. She changes the atmosphere around basketball. Every arena she enters feels different. Every game she plays in carries extra weight. Television ratings move when her name appears on a schedule. Ticket prices surge when her team comes to town. Merchandise sells out before the season even tips off. That kind of gravitational pull is extraordinarily rare. Most players spend entire careers trying to build that level of influence and never quite reach it. Clark didn't chase it. It followed her. From college gymnasiums packed beyond capacity to professional arenas that suddenly couldn't fit everyone who wanted inside. And now standing inside that quiet Indiana gym going shot after shot after shot without missing. She wasn't just preparing for another season. She was preparing for something much larger than a regular schedule. And the rest of the basketball world was only beginning to understand exactly what that meant. But before we break down every layer of this story, understand one thing clearly. What is unfolding right now inside the WNBA is not a simple sports story. It is a cultural moment. It is a power shift. It is the kind of once-in-a-generation event that changes how an entire sport is perceived, funded, and followed for decades to come. The practice footage was just the surface. Underneath it sits a far more complicated picture involving rivalries, injuries, contract battles, international ambitions, and a league that is simultaneously thriving and fracturing at the exact same moment. Every piece of this story connects to the next. And if you want to understand where women's basketball is truly headed, you cannot afford to miss a single chapter of what comes next. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now because this story is only getting started. And the next section reveals something about the system Clark walked into that most fans never fully understood. Here's the thing about Caitlin Clark. The casual fans still underestimate. She doesn't just play basketball. She changes the atmosphere around basketball. Every arena she enters feels different. Every game she plays in carries extra weight. Television ratings move when her name appears on a schedule. Ticket prices surge when her team comes to town. Merchandise sells out before the season even tips off. That kind of gravitational pull is extraordinarily rare. Most players spend entire careers trying to build that level of influence and never quite reach it. Clark didn't chase it. It followed her from college gymnasiums packed beyond capacity to professional arenas that suddenly couldn't fit everyone who wanted inside. And now standing inside that quiet Indiana gym going shot after shot after shot without missing. She wasn't just preparing for another season. She was preparing for something much larger than a regular schedule. And the rest of the basketball world was only beginning to understand exactly what that meant. But before we break down every layer of this story, understand one thing clearly. What is unfolding right now inside the WNBA is not a simple sports story. It is a cultural moment. It is a power shift. It is the kind of once-in-a-generation event that changes how an entire sport is perceived, funded, and followed for decades to come. The practice footage was just the surface. Underneath it sits a far more complicated picture involving rivalries, injuries, contract battles, international ambitions, and a league that is simultaneously thriving and fracturing at the exact same moment. Every piece of this story connects to the next. And if you want to understand where women's basketball is truly headed, you cannot afford to miss a single chapter of what comes next. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is only getting started and the next section reveals something about the system Clark walked into that most fans never fully understood. To truly understand what Caitlin Clark's arrival meant, you have to understand the world she stepped into. The WNBA did not greet her as a finished product. It greeted her as a league still searching for its own identity. Decades of passionate players, dedicated coaches, and loyal fans had built something real, something worth protecting. But the financial foundation underneath it had always been unsteady. Attendance figures fluctuated wildly from city to city. Television deals brought visibility, but not the kind of transformative money that changes a league's trajectory overnight. Sponsorship interest existed, but it came in carefully measured doses. Players who dedicated their entire athletic careers to the sport were earning salaries that forced many of them to play overseas during the offseason just to survive financially. That wasn't a secret. It was an open wound that the league carried for years. And into that complicated, fragile, deeply human environment, one of the most hyped rookies in basketball history was about to walk through the door. And nobody fully agreed on what should happen next. The tension inside the league wasn't born the moment Clark arrived. It was already simmering long before her name appeared on a draft board. Veterans had spent years fighting for better conditions, better pay, and better recognition. They had sacrificed enormously for a sport that the mainstream world had consistently undervalued. So, when a single player arrived and immediately generated the kind of attention that entire rosters had failed to produce collectively, the emotional response was never going to be simple. Some players celebrated the wave of new fans. Others quietly wondered why it took one particular face to finally make the casual world pay attention. That tension was never fully spoken aloud. It lived underneath handshakes and post-game interviews. It lived in the silence between public statements. And it created a fault line inside the league that was always just one moment away from cracking wide open. The question was never whether it would crack. The question was what would finally push it over the edge. Caitlin Clark did not arrive in the WNBA trying to start a revolution. She arrived trying to play basketball. That distinction matters more than most people realize. She wasn't carrying a manifesto. She wasn't making demands. She wasn't positioning herself as the savior of anything. She simply showed up, laced her sneakers, and started doing what she had always done, launching shots from distances that made defensive coordinators physically uncomfortable, threading passes through gaps that most players wouldn't even identify as opportunities. Reading the floor with a kind of spatial intelligence that looked less like athleticism and more like chess mastery, operating at full speed. And the crowds responded instantly, not gradually. Not after a few weeks of adjustment, instantly. Arenas that had operated at comfortable but unremarkable attendance figures suddenly found themselves turning people away at the door. Cities that had never generated serious buzz around a WNBA game were now hosting events that felt closer to playoff atmospheres than regular season tip-offs. And Clark hadn't done anything except play the game she had always played. But the world around her was changing faster than anyone had predicted. The media framing that surrounded her rookie season added another complicated layer to an already delicate situation. Every broadcast seemed to focus the camera on Clark a few seconds longer than necessary. Every highlight package led with her name. Every storyline somehow circled back to her presence in the league. For fans who were discovering women's basketball for the first time, that felt completely natural. She was the reason they tuned in. She was the reason they bought tickets. She was the entry point for an entirely new generation of viewers. But for players who had spent years building careers in relative obscurity, watching the camera consistently drift past them and settle on one face carried a sting that no post-game statistic could measure. And that sting, quiet and unspoken as it was, began accumulating beneath the surface of every practice, every locker room conversation, and every game where the spotlight burned a little brighter over one particular corner of the court. Something was building, and the league was about to find out it had no real plan for handling it. What started as unspoken tension didn't stay unspoken for long. The first signs appeared in small moments that casual fans easily dismissed. A hard foul that lingered a second too long. A post-game comment that carried just enough edge to generate headlines without crossing any official line. A social media post that said almost nothing and somehow said everything simultaneously. These weren't accidents. They were pressure releasing itself through the only cracks available. Because when frustration builds inside a professional sports environment and nobody creates a safe space for honest conversation, it doesn't disappear. It transforms. It finds outlets. It sharpens itself into something more pointed and more public with every passing week. And the media, always hunting for the next compelling narrative, was more than happy to amplify every signal it could detect. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about belonging. It was about who deserved the spotlight. It was about whether a league built by decades of sacrifice was being handed to someone who hadn't yet paid the same price. Those are not small questions. Those are the kinds of questions that fracture locker rooms and divide fan bases and follow players through entire careers. Fan reactions added an entirely new dimension to an already explosive situation. The audiences that Clark brought into women's basketball were passionate, enormous in number, and not always familiar with the culture and history they were stepping into. Some approached the sport with genuine curiosity and respect. Others arrived carrying assumptions, comparisons, and opinions that landed with the subtlety of a thunderclap inside a library. Online spaces became battlegrounds where every play, every foul, every sideline interaction was dissected, magnified, and weaponized by competing groups who each believed they were defending something important. Players found their names trending for reasons that had nothing to do with their performance on the court. Coaches issued carefully worded statements that satisfied nobody. League officials monitored the situation with growing anxiety while simultaneously celebrating the record-breaking viewership numbers that were funding conversations about expansion and new television deals. The sport was simultaneously thriving and tearing itself apart. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, largely unbothered and terrifyingly focused, Caitlin Clark kept showing up to the gym, and what she was quietly building inside those walls was about to change the entire conversation. There are moments in sports that don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, almost accidentally, disguised as ordinary training sessions that nobody planned to remember. The morning Caitlin Clark walked into that Indiana Fever practice facility was supposed to be exactly that kind of forgettable day, no special occasion, no scheduled media presence, no reason for the basketball world to stop and pay attention. Just a player working through her off-season routine with the kind of disciplined repetition that rarely generates headlines. But then the ball started moving and the net started singing, and somewhere around the 15th consecutive make, the people inside that gym began exchanging glances that carried a very specific meaning. The meaning that says something unusual is happening right now and nobody quite knows how to process it. By the time the session ended and the numbers were confirmed, 22 made three-pointers from well beyond the professional line. Out of only 25 attempts, the atmosphere inside that facility had shifted completely because everyone present understood the same thing simultaneously. What they had just witnessed was not a hot streak. It was a statement. The footage spread across social media with the kind of velocity that only happens when something genuinely stops people mid-scroll. Comments flooded in from every corner of the basketball community. Former players called it one of the most impressive practice performances they had ever seen documented at the professional level. Shooting coaches immediately began analyzing her release mechanics frame by frame, searching for the technical adjustments that produced such extraordinary consistency. Defensive coordinators around the league watched the clip in silence, already mentally revising the game plans they had spent months constructing. But the detail that generated the most intense conversation wasn't the percentage itself. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't even